Hello, everyone. It's Michael Shermer here with The Michael Shermer Show. Before I introduce today's guest, this episode is brought to you by Wondrium. Wondrium is a series of college-level audio and video courses and documentaries produced and distributed by the Teaching Company. Wondrium brings you engaging educational content through short-form videos, long-form courses, tutorials, how-to lessons, travelogues, documentaries, and more, covering every topic you've ever wondered about and many you never thought you'd wonder about. Most of you have heard me talk about Wondrium before. I've produced a couple of courses for the Great Courses Teaching Company, one on Skepticism 101, another one on conspiracies and conspiracy theories. I listen to these all the time. Here is, you just touch the app, as you know, and it pops up. It's a subscription service, so you subscribe and you get access to hundreds and hundreds of courses and documentary films and so on. I just popped it open right now. I haven't looked at it in a few days. Here is a new one called War in the Modern World. Dive into military history and strategy with this 24-episode course focused on the geopolitical conflicts, weapons, strategies, and personalities that have defined war since 1945. Yes, I'm going to listen to this one. Here's just a few samples of the 24 lectures. Afghanistan and the nature of modern war. That sounds pretty relevant to us today, right? Nightmare scenarios of the modern war. The tools of modern warfare, from World War to Cold War. Europe's exit from colonial Asia. China's civil war. Okay, I'll skip down. France's Vietnam War. India, Pakistan. The World War that never happened. Wonder what that's about. It could be the Cuban Missile Crisis. Well, we'll see. The Soviet War in Afghanistan. We should have learned our lessons from them, right? The Iraq-Iran War, Desert Storm, Yugoslavia's civil wars, a new Russian empire, question mark. Well, at least that's what they're attempting. And finally, Iraq and ISIS in the war on terror. Okay, so here's the deal. When you subscribe to the Wondrium program, you get through this program, you get 20% off the annual plan and a free trial. So go to wondrium.com/Shermer to get a free trial, give it a try, and why would you not want to subscribe after that? And if you do, you get 20% off the annual plan. So that's Wondrium, WONDRIUM.com/Shermer, as you know, SHERMER, Wondrium.com/Shermer. Check it out, folks. It's great, and I'm really honored to have them as our podcast advertiser and supporter. So thanks, and thanks for listening. All right, we are live with Anil Seth, the new book, Being You, the new science, a new science of consciousness, not necessarily the new science of consciousness. Nice to see you again, and congratulations on the new paper you just sent me today. We're talking, by the way, on May 4th, as in May the 4th be with you, as is going around as a meme. Your new paper, just published in the prestigious Nature Neuroscience Journal, is Theories of Consciousness, with you and Tim Bain, your colleague here. You know, what strikes me about this is you have this table of a selection of theories of consciousness, just a selection. There must be 20 of them on here. It's just astonishing. I've already read them in the introduction, so I won't read them again here. But, you know, when I see a list like that, I mean, if it was like, we're not sure about the origin of the universe, we have the Big Bang Theory and the steady state theory and 20 other theories, and we weren't sure which is the right one, to me that would indicate, okay, there's some problem going on here that, you know, we haven't figured out exactly how to get at the right theory when you have so much confusion like that. So so let's just start there. What is the problem to be solved, and why are there so many different theories about it?
The problem to be solved essentially is pretty simple. I think we're all very familiar with what consciousness is. It's what goes away when you fall into a dreamless sleep and what returns when you wake up. Or if you go under general anesthesia, you really go into oblivion and then consciousness goes away. And, assuming things go well in the OR, you come round again, consciousness returns. There are some things for which we generally would agree are not conscious, tables and chairs and things like that, perhaps computers as well as we have them now. And other things that we have an intuition are, not just human beings, but perhaps some, maybe not all, other animals. And everything is made out of stuff. We're made out of stuff. Tables are made out of stuff. Quarks, atoms, molecules. The real fundamental question of consciousness is, why are some of these things conscious, having subjective experiences, and why are others not? The philosopher Tom Nagel, I think, puts it best when he says, for a conscious organism, there is something it is like to be that organism. There's something it's like to be me, to be you, but there's nothing it's like to be a table or a chair. That's the problem, the fundamental problem of consciousness. And you're right, there's a lot of theories. And this paper that just came out today, we had a table with about 20, maybe that's the exact number. And of course, already in the few hours that it's been out, I've had several emails from people with theories of their own that we didn't include, we didn't know about, I forgot about, we didn't have space. There's as many theories as you want.
That's amazing.
And why are there so many? I think it's partly because, unlike some of the other sort of questions which in science, there may be a very firm consensus on how to go about the answer, or what kind of shape the answer ought to be. With consciousness, although the basic question, I think, is quite well recognized by many, precisely what aspects of that question or how to answer that question differs a lot between people, between research groups, and so on. Like, some people will try to explain this question of how and why consciousness is part of the universe in the first place, the big question, what David Chalmers called the hard problem. Some theories focus on explaining why specific experiences are the way they are, like why is the experience of redness different from the experience of pain. Others focus on level of consciousness. What's the difference between anaesthesia and normal wakefulness? Others focus on function, like what can we do as organisms in virtue of being conscious? What's the functional value or even the evolutionary value of being conscious? So there are many questions that come under this big tent question of consciousness, and different theories pick out different areas of that space. Some are more comprehensive than others. And this is one reason we have this plethora of options available.
Yeah, I was rewatching your TED Talk last night. I just noticed it's got 13 million views. Astonishing. And that to me indicates people care about this. They're interested in it. You know, when I was a graduate psych program in the late 70s, nobody was talking about this. And I vaguely remember in the late 90s, my friend Christoph Koch at Caltech, when we had our lecture series there, he was kind of getting into this. And I thought, I wonder where this is going to go. And now it's gone quite a ways. I was just looking at the list of my guests that have discussed this subject on the show, just the last 2 years. Christoph Koch, David Chalmers, Philip Goff, Dan Dennett, Steven Pinker, Antonio Damasio, Colin McGinn, Deepak Chopra, John Joe McFadden, Ogi Ogos, most recently. It's like, and I don't pick these things out because I'm obsessed with the subject or whatever, although I'm interested in it. The guests come to me through their publicists because they have new books. So that and these aren't technical books, they're mostly popular books that anybody could read. So that tells me there's a market for it. People are willing to plunk down $20 to read a book about consciousness. So why this particular time in history, do you think? And why you're doing that, giving us your thoughts on that, what is your story? How did you get interested in this subject?
I think the two are very interlinked. I mean, I feel very lucky to have grown up at a time where consciousness was back on the menu in academic departments of psychology and neuroscience. But it wasn't like that when I was an undergrad student or even a grad student, really. I think there is this wide appetite to think about, understand more about, learn about consciousness, which is why there are so many books, so many people talking about it, because it's an interest we all have at some point in our lives. For me, it was when I was quite a young kid. I remember looking in the mirror one day and just realizing that at some point I would die. And then that led to a question like, what does it mean to be me? Who was I before I was born? Where was I? What was I? And from there, all the other questions follow. And these are questions that, as I became a teenager and grew up, you argue about with your friends, like, do we have free will? Does that exist? I mean, these are fun and meaningful conversations to have, even when you don't know anything about the philosophy or the science. So they're always there. And then, I guess for most people, because consciousness for a long time was not a core part of psychology or neuroscience. Of course, it was right at the beginning when psychology and neuroscience were created as disciplines in the late 19th century. Consciousness was front and center, as it should be. It's the most obvious phenomenon about having a human brain, at least anyway, thing you most want to understand. But because it's hard to study, we can't study consciousness objectively in the same way we can study other things about brains and bodies. It faded out of the spotlight and it became something disreputable, which is why, although there were pockets of really good work going on throughout the 20th century, it was not part of your typical undergraduate or postgraduate program about the mind and brain sciences. I was always interested, but then when I got to my undergraduate at Cambridge, I went there, I thought I would study physics because that for me was like, physics is the queen of all sciences. Everything in the end comes down to physics. And if I want to understand consciousness, physics is the place to start. Of course, at that time, I had no pretensions it would become a career. I was just thought, this is the thing to study. And there was no consciousness in that degree, but I ended up shifting towards experimental psychology. I just found that absolutely fascinating, that there were, in fact, experiments being done that spoke a little bit about consciousness. The work of people like Oliver Sacks was already there, looking at the effects of brain injury on people's conscious experiences. So there were pockets. And then I think when I moved from undergrad into grad school in the mid-90s, this did coincide with a bit of the rebirth of consciousness science. And you ask why that happened, and I think there's a number of reasons. The first reason is that there just new generations of people came through that were less less beholden by the baggage of psychology as it had been, more willing to entertain that consciousness is worth studying. Psychology had already transitioned from just studying behavior, as in behaviorism, to thinking about cognition, what's happening within minds, which is closer to consciousness. And so it's a natural next step to return to thinking about conscious states as well. Then there was the advent of brain imaging, which became very widespread. We have fMRI scanners. We can look inside the living human brain while people are experiencing different things. It's often overplayed, I think, the value of brain imaging, but it's certainly extremely valuable. And as a catalyst for work in this area, people would start to look for the neural correlates of consciousness. And then the last thing was you mentioned people like Christoph Koch and his mentor, Francis Crick, the Nobel laureate, along with James Watson. And my old boss was Gerald Edelman, another Nobel laureate. These were people who'd earned their stripes in other areas of biology who then came into neuroscience and decided to focus on consciousness. And that, I think, also helped transform the field because you had people expending major capital by saying that this is okay, this is a good thing, an important thing to study, and paved the way for other people, some of your other guests and me and my colleagues too, to get jobs in this area, to get funding for it, to be able to publish papers like this paper we've published today, which I think would have been very hard 20 years ago.
Yeah, I think the social sciences have always had kind of an image, or at least a self-image problem, that we are not the queen of the sciences like physics. We would like that kind of respect. What do we got to do to get that? We have to have very strict operational definitions of exactly what we're measuring, what we're studying, and then how to measure it in some very quantitative way. So the whole behaviorist movement, and then in the 80s, the cognitive movement, kind of moving in that direction. And consciousness was always in that kind of 19th century introspection. So what's going on in your mind right now? And then the person would just talk. That doesn't feel like a physics kind of experiment, right? So I think that, that move toward brain imaging at least feels like we're getting closer to a very specific measurement of something going on. Or Oliver Sacks, when he says, well, there's this damage to the fusiform gyrus in the temporal lobe, which is where facial recognition happens. And this person has this problem that he can't recognize faces. So obviously it must be right there at that spot. And that feels, much more quantitative and scientific than just an introspection type technique.
Yeah, I think it does. Of course, it can be overplayed. One of the dangers of brain imaging is that you become excessively localist like this and say, okay, this is the brain region that does this. Where is the seat of consciousness? We've probably all agreed against Descartes that it's not in the pineal gland, this little gland in the middle of the brain, but is it in another specific location? And of course, you can use brain imaging in other ways too. And I think more and more people are, to look at patterns of connectivity, patterns of information flow, rather than one area or the other. But yeah, it does help, but it's not the only solution. Right back at the beginning of psychology as well, sure, there was introspection, but it was also all about measurement. Some of the earliest psychology experiments were really, really detailed measurements of reaction
like
times.
Psychophysics.
People like Donders were doing in Holland. Exactly. And psychophysics is just as much, if not more, part of consciousness science these days as neuroimaging. Of course, the two go together. But psychophysics is exactly that. You're making very precise measurements about people's experiences, and they're reported in very, very quantitative ways through fine differences in response times and things. So the methods many of the methods have always been there, but brain imaging adds substantially to the repertoire of what we can do.
Yeah. So let's kind of drill down again on what the problem is to be solved. So there's the so-called easy problem, the neural correlates of parts of consciousness. So visual imagery happens here in the occipital lobe, and language is processed in the Broca's area and so forth. And we can kind of drill down on that. And that's it's a hard problem to solve, but in principle it's solvable. So it's the so-called easy problem. But the harder problem then is, what is it like to see something? What is it like to hear a voice or process a word? The experience of understanding language. That seems... So here's my question. Is this what philosophers call a category error? It's like you're asking the question the same way you would this other problem, and it's a completely different kind of problem, and you can't use the same techniques to answer it.
Well, I think it's true that you can't necessarily use the same techniques. I'm not sure it's wholly a category error. I think there are some philosophical positions, such as illusionism, that philosophers like Keith Frankish and to some extent Dan Dennett subscribe to, which is that we're really mistaken about believing there is a hard problem of consciousness at all, that the category mistake is informing the question in the first place. I am not completely compelled by that. I'm very compelled by a lot of what they say, that I don't think consciousness is necessarily this to be found in some special source, some sort of magic dust that creates experience out of mechanism. But I do think that consciousness is a real phenomenon that we should take as existing. In fact, it's the only thing I can really be sure of, to paraphrase Descartes again. It's, I experience, therefore I am. So conscious experiences really exist. And you're right, there is a distinct kind of problem, the easy problems. And this goes back to David Chalmers, of course, who popularized this distinction. The easy problems are all the problems about how brains work that can be explained while brushing consciousness under the table a little bit. You say, how does the brain transform sensory input into motor outputs? How does it generate behavior? How does it perform all the functions in the vicinity of consciousness? And you're right, they're not simple to solve, but they're in principle soluble. Complex mechanisms could do the job. And the hard problem is, how and why is any of this accompanied by experience? Why does experience happen? How does experience happen? That's the hard problem. And it seems a very, very difficult problem, because the intuition is that no explanation in terms of mechanisms could ever do the job. You would always be left with the so-called explanatory gap. And then what? And then why is there experience? Where do you find it in this mechanism? And so I've come to think over the years to be a little bit agnostic about whether there actually is a hard problem or not. I think consciousness exists, but I do think that addressing the hard problem head on is not the most productive way for a science of consciousness to develop. And the analogy I always use, and it's an imperfect analogy, admittedly, but it's still helpful, is how our understanding of life developed. It really wasn't that long ago that biologists of the day thought there had to be some élan vital in this case, some spark of life that explained the difference between the living and the non-living. There was a common view that physics and chemistry just weren't up to the job. There had to be something over and above that to explain what life is. That's the philosophy of vitalism. But of course, that didn't persist. And even though we don't understand everything about how life works, there's no longer this sense that it's over and above physics and chemistry, that it requires a spark of life. And part of the reason for that is that instead of trying to find this solution to the hard problem of life, people realize that life is it's a constellation concept. That there are many different properties that living systems have: metabolism, reproduction, homeostasis, self-repair. And if you can explain how organisms achieve and instantiate these properties one by one, then gradually the hard problem of life dissolves and it no longer seems to be this big mystery. So that's the approach that I call the real problem of consciousness, with it's a little bit of a dig at Dave Chalmers in a friendly way and respectful way. But nonetheless, I think it's also what a lot of us in practice do. We try and not only find correlations between what happens in brains and bodies and conscious experiences, but try to build explanatory bridges, try to explain why particular experiences go along with particular things happening in the brain. And what are the different properties of consciousness? Instead of treating it as one big scary mystery, what properties do we want to explain when we're trying to explain consciousness? And as we do that, I think we can chip away at the hard problem. Whether it dissolves completely in a puff of metaphysical smoke at the end is for me still an open question, but I think it's more likely to do that than to come up with some other sort of semi-magical solution, like it's in the quantum dust or microtubules or some other thing. I think this is a much more pragmatic way to go that respects the on the face of it mystery that's posed by the reality of consciousness.
I don't remember who it was. I think it might have been Henry Bergson who made that analogy with Elan locomotive to explain how a locomotive operates along the lines of Elan Vital. Like, it's just a trick of language to say, well, I don't know what's inside there. It's the Elan locomotive that pushes the train forward. But of course, we know exactly how the steam engine works and so forth. So what you're saying is that over the course of about a century or so of research in medical and biological and physiological fields, it just stopped being talked about because we understood life to be a process on many different levels, and we understand it pretty well now. The mystery just disappeared.
Yeah, exactly. And the analogy is not perfect because studying life had one major advantage, which is that you can put living organisms on a table and sort of pick them apart and agree objectively about the data. The big problem with studying consciousness is that the data are intrinsically subjective, which gets us back to this why it became disreputable in the first place, because we have to rely at some level on people's subjective reports about what they experience. So that does make it harder. And consciousness may not turn out to be like life anyway. It may turn out to be something that requires another kind of explanation. And there are some theories that take that view. Integrated information theory, for instance, says that consciousness is integrated information in some very specific mathematical way. And under that theory, you can attribute consciousness to lots of non-biological things. It's the sort of semi-panpsychist view. That might be right, that kind of view, but it's not, for me, obviously or necessarily right. And it might well be that by explaining the different properties of consciousness, we've really done what scientific explanations generally do, which is they explain a phenomenon, they're able to predict a phenomenon, and they allow intervention and control of a phenomenon. That's in general what science does. But somehow for consciousness, we always want a bit more. We want, like, well, why is it me? Why does it exist? I mean, physics doesn't tell us why the universe exists. I mean, maybe there are some theories which try and tell us there are many universes, there is one. But physics can be extremely successful at explaining, predicting, and controlling the properties of atoms, molecules, and matter. And if a science of consciousness can do the same for conscious experiences, we've done pretty well already, even if we are still left a little bit flummoxed by why and how consciousness is part of the universe.
Yeah, it's like...
So my main objection is wrapping all these things together to say we've made no progress just because we might still wonder how consciousness is part of the universe.
So it would be,
we've made a lot of progress.
It would be unsatisfactory to you to say, like quantum physicists do to people who, like Deepak Chopra, who want to extrapolate from quantum physics some deep metaphysical idea like consciousness. Shut up and calculate. Just don't worry about where the universe came from or why the laws are the way they are. Let's just start there and start calculating. But there is something different about consciousness that's different from that physics problem. So, and I love that part about your book, the analogy with the Elan Vital just disappears. And to make your case, you open with talking about general anesthesia. I just did this again for, I don't know, the fourth time in my life, I guess, maybe fifth, having torn a Achilles tendon. I had to get the Achilles tendon surgery. So, down you go. And so, at least in the United States, they're required to ask you. They come into the little room like 20 minutes before they're going to put you under and say, do you have any questions? The anesthesiologist does. So I always ask him the same thing. Yeah, where does my consciousness go when you put me under? And he rolls his eyes like, oh, another one of these assholes. He's just basically, it doesn't go anywhere. I just turn it off and then it comes back online. Yeah, but how, where, and so on. Well, so you open with your own example of that. So would an answer be, again, it doesn't go anywhere because we're thinking of it, it's floating around up there, then it floats off somewhere and it hovers there for a while and then it comes back in. Of course, nothing like that. It's just a chemical process, and the anesthesiologist jiggers the chemistry, and it just stops. And then after a while, it just starts bubbling up again and comes back on after an hour or two. Is it something like that would be just a physiological chemical process that needs no other explanation?
Well, I think there are going to be different levels of explanation. And by the way, you're right. Yeah, I start the book with anesthesia because for me, this was one of the more meaningful non-experiences of my life. And it's the closest you can get to death. You're really not there. And you could be under for a few minutes. You could be under for a few hours or perhaps even months. You wouldn't know. You don't notice the difference because you're just simply not there. Very different from being asleep. And so something is happening. So anesthesia is indeed, it's a chemical intervention, pharmaceutical intervention in the brain. Something is happening to the chemical and electrical signaling in the brain that abolishes the ability of this wetware inside your skull to generate the experience of being anything. And quite what's going on is still a little unclear, but it's one of those beautiful cases where I think, on the one hand, consciousness is a big mystery, but on the other hand, it's right here. It's a very accessible mystery. We have the means, the experimental means to turn consciousness on and off, to study what happens. And it's not like we don't have to build another James Webb telescope that's going to take 10 years to get some data. We can get the data. And it's at a human scale because we are human. So what does happen under anesthesia? Well, there are some fascinating clues already. I think the part of the story, and maybe the main part of the story, is that anesthesia breaks down communication between different brain areas. So, and this has been shown in a number of experiments. The experiments that I think are, for me, the most persuasive are ones which use a so-called zap and zip method. So you inject a strong pulse of magnetic energy into the brain, and then you use electroencephalography to listen to the echo of that magnetic pulse. And by listening to the echo, you can get a sense of how different parts of the brain are speaking to each other. And it's a little bit like throwing a stone into a pond of still water. And if the water is completely still, you still see ripples, but they don't really do anything very interesting. But if there are, you throw many stones in and there's complicated waves going around, then your patterns are much more interesting. And you can get some sense of, what's happening in the pond. So we can do this in the waking state and in sleep and anesthesia. And what you see is that in anesthesia, when consciousness is lost, you still see an activation to the pulse, but it's very simple. Stays local to where the pulse is. Other brain regions don't get so much involved. So it sounds as if different parts of the brain are disconnected from each other. And that, the people who've done this work, largely Marcello Massimini in Milan and Giulio Tononi in Wisconsin, have even managed to put a number to this. So we have the beginnings of a consciousness meter, which for me is quite amazing, but it also shows some of the practical relevance of consciousness science. This isn't just a problem that we'd be happy to solve sitting in our armchairs. It makes a real difference in the operating room, in the psychiatric clinic, and in other places. So anesthesia is disrupting communication in the brain. Of course, it might be doing other things too. Exactly what the mechanism of action of anesthesia is still much debated, what it's doing at the level of individual neurons, individual cells. But that's the broad story.
But this would suggest then that consciousness emerges from multiple modules or networks firing along in some kind of coordinated unitary way. And if that's true, then simpler brains must have fewer degrees of consciousness, and more complex brains with more systems operating at the same time would have more degrees of consciousness, something like that. So my dog he's conscious for sure. He's not self-aware, but he's aware. He must know what it's like to be him. But he isn't capable of thinking about that or even processing that as a question like we are, because he doesn't have language and symbolic communication in his own head. And then you go down from there, a mouse, a cockroach, a single cell paramecium moving around in the environment, and it follows some chemical gradient or it follows a beam of light. And it's consciously interacting with the environment. So that would be like the simplest degree of consciousness scaling all the way up. Would it be something like that?
There's a few things in that we should, I think, segregate out. So there's at least two different senses of level of consciousness here. There's level of consciousness within an individual, such as when you go under anesthesia or into a dreamless sleep. And then there's level of consciousness across different species or even during development. Level of consciousness for a human infant compared to an adult, or you compared to your dog or a paramecium, indeed. And I think that they're two separate concepts. And especially for the second concept, I think we often have this danger of anthropocentrism. We tend to think that humans are the center of everything, the top of every pyramid, and relate other forms of consciousness as sort of lower than or lesser than our example in some ways. And we are definitely distinctive in many ways. We're distinctive through our culture, through our language, but we may not be the most conscious of all creatures. I think that's a little bit of human hubris creeping in there. But you're also right that there's a distinction between awareness and self-awareness, and often it's conflated. So when you might ask just people in the street what they think consciousness means, a common response is that it's self-consciousness. It's I'm aware of who I am. But I think that's not a necessary feature of consciousness. It's quite possible to be conscious without being self-conscious. And of course, dogs, many animals, human infants up to a point, don't necessarily have this reflective sense of self-awareness. The classic test for this is the mirror self-recognition test. Does a creature recognize that its mirror image is an image of itself? And this is surprisingly difficult for creatures to pass. And of course, there may be other tests, but it's a useful indication that self-consciousness is not to be taken for granted. And just the third thing you said there was emergence, which is this idea that, consciousness, in some sense, is an emergent property of the collective behavior of different brain regions and ultimately many billions of neurons. And this is true, but I'm always a bit wary of this word emergent because it again can be used as a placeholder, right? It's a bit like Elan Vital in this way. Yet it emerges. You have all this stuff and then consciousness emerges. Where does the magic happen? Emergence. And so I think here's another word where it really pays to be precise about what we mean by emergence. There's a distinction in philosophy between strong and weak emergence. So strong emergence is where the global property is in principle irreducible to the local, the micro level components. And then there are other forms of emergence where the relationship is in principle reducible. It's just very, very complicated. The typical examples are things like flocks of birds wheeling in the sky. And we know they're nothing more than the combined trajectories of the individual birds, but the flock seems to have an identity and a behavior of its own. So actually with my colleagues at Sussex and in London, we've been working, and other groups are doing this now too, we're working on mathematical measures of emergence that bring some specificity to what we mean. When is it reasonable to say that the collective activity of a group of neurons is emergent from the individual neurons? And if so, How much is it emergent? And again, this isn't with a view to solving the hard problem of consciousness, but towards giving us a tool that we can apply to the real problem of consciousness. Can we use quantitative measures of emergence to track the changes of consciousness across different global states and perhaps in even different local states, like I'm conscious of A rather than B?
Yeah, I like the idea of emergence because
So I'm always trying to get rid of the magic.
Yes, oh, totally. That's what I do what I do for a living. And a lot of these theories of consciousness that I've encountered, that's exactly what happens. It was like, I think it was Antonio Damasio talking about maps of the body in the brain, and then maps of the maps, and then maps of the maps of the maps. And then the magic happens, and there's some big map that maps all the other maps, and that's consciousness. I'm oversimplifying what he said, but it's along those lines. And it always reminds me of that Sidney Harris cartoon with the two mathematicians at the chalkboard, and in the middle part of the equation is, and then a miracle happens, and the other one says, I think you need to be more specific here in step 2. And I usually apply that to creationism, because they said, and then the magic happens, God comes in and tweakers the RNA and makes it DNA or whatever it supposedly does. It's like, yeah, but how does God do that? What's the mechanism, right? How exactly does that happen? And that's the problem you're trying to solve. Yeah, so a couple other things here I wanted to ask you about. The red dot test. I don't know how much confidence you put on that, of what it's telling us about what's going on inside the brain of an animal, which is hard to get at. And there's not many, right? The chimps with the red dot, elephants, you paint a big splotch of white on their side, and they look in the mirror and they swat at it with their trunk. And dolphins, apparently, you put a big splotch on their side and they'll look in the mirror and flip around like there's something weird. I guess we're inferring that they know that's me in the mirror, and there's something off about, why is that thing on my forehead? I'm going to brush it off or whatever. So that does feel like it's another level of complexity that emerges, or whatever it does, that, say, my dog would have no idea that's him in the mirror. He just thinks another dog, or he ignores it. And so that would be like, just more levels of complexity leads to that. But where's the magic happen?
Yeah, I think a couple of things about the mirror test. The first is that it really tells us something about the diversity of other minds. And this is because it seems so natural to us. We look in the mirror as adult humans, and it's not something we have to think about, right? We just know it's us. It's not a skill we learn explicitly. We just, it's me. And if you think about it, that's quite a skill, because we didn't evolve with mirrors. We may have seen the odd glimpse of ourselves in the surfaces of still ponds and so on. But to automatically recognize mirror images as us, and for that to be as fluent as recognizing that looking at a different person is not us, is meaningful. It's not to be taken for granted. And the fact that some other creatures who have sophisticated visual systems, many other primates, macaque monkeys, the creatures that have been much studied for the similarity of their visual systems to humans, cannot do this. Maybe after very, very extensive training, but it just doesn't come naturally whatsoever. That speaks to there are differences in minds between us and even very similar creatures. So that's one thing it makes me think of. The other question is, what can we infer by a failure to pass the mirror test? Does it mean that these creatures really do lack a sense of self-awareness? And I think that inference is unsafe. There are many reasons why creatures could fail. They could fail simply because they don't like mirrors, or they want to avoid eye contact, or because their bodies are so malleable that the notion of having a regular, identifiable physical profile is less meaningful. Here I'm thinking about creatures like octopuses. And then there are some cases where you have to adapt the test so much that it's no longer clear what it's really testing. So for dogs, people have been looking at olfactory mirrors and things like that. So I think it's not, for me, the single line of demarcation between awareness and self-awareness. The other reason for that is there are many more things to the experience of being a self than recognizing my image as being me. We can experience selfhood on many more, I would say, more fundamental levels, like this particular physical object that goes around with my mind all the time, that's my body. I have an experience of things in the world that are my body and things that aren't. And I don't have to look in a mirror for that. I just know. And that level of selfhood may well extend much more widely in the animal kingdom. And for me, anyway, emotion is also part of self. The emotions that I feel are experiences of selfhood. They're not things I experience out there in the world. And emotions are, I would argue, very likely some of the more fundamental and probably some of the oldest, evolutionarily speaking, conscious experiences that ever existed and are probably likely to be quite widespread.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, this reminds me a little bit of the research on theory of mind development in children and Alison Gopnik's experiments in the 90s, where something happens between the age of 3 and 4 in which children all of a sudden can take the perspective of another child. So Alison's famous experiment of this little Snoopy doll is she takes out a box of crayons and asks the child, what do you think is in this box? And they go, crayons. And then she opens it up and there's candles in there. And then it's candles. The kid's surprised. She puts the candles back in the box and she says, okay, now while we've been talking, Snoopy down here doesn't know what we're talking about. It didn't see anything. And then pulls Snoopy up and says, now what do you think Snoopy will think is in this box? And the 3-year-olds go, candles. They can't think like, well, Snoopy didn't know this. So, but 4-year-olds go, well, he'll think it's crayons, of course. And so something happens there where they can all of a sudden take that leap into somebody else's head and imagine what that world would look like or that question would be answered from that perspective. That also seems like another one of these something coming online that wasn't there before.
That's right. And it comes on a bit later than self-recognition. So human infants typically develop mirror self-recognition somewhere between 12 and 18 months. So before this later cognitive theory of mind milestone. But yeah, I think it does mark out a transition, and it also happens naturally, right? It's not something, at least to my knowledge, that you have to train kids to do. It just comes online at some point. And again, there's a really fascinating interspecies contrast here. I was really lucky a few years ago, had the chance to go to a place called Cayo Santiago. It's also known as Monkey Island. It's off the coast of Puerto Rico. And I was there with Laurie Santos, who's a primatologist. And we were doing some filming for this documentary called The Most Unknown. But so my role for this part of the film was just to follow Laurie around the island and watch her explain about the monkeys. And one of the experiments she was doing was a version of exactly what you described from Alison Gopnik's lab. It was trying to see whether monkey A could understand the world from the perspective of monkey B. And these experiments are so difficult to do because generally they don't seem to. But then you don't know really what's in their minds. And when you try and set up experiments to make more specific claims, you're distorting their natural world. So you're making the world less sort of ecologically meaningful for them. So then if they don't interact with it as you expect, it becomes also quite hard to know what to make of it. But it was another example, a bit like when I spent some time with octopuses about, I'm in the presence of creatures whose minds are very different, who see the world in very different ways. And I think there was something quite humbling about both of those experiences.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. I think I must have seen that documentary because as you were talking about it, I remember seeing you and her running around that island. Yeah, that was very interesting. Do you remember the name of that documentary? I have to watch that again.
Yeah, it's called The Most Unknown. It was
that's right.
I think it's still on Netflix. It is in the UK anyway. It had an interesting premise. The premise was they picked 9 scientists from very different fields, and we weren't told who we were going to be paired with. And each of us went to visit another scientist, and we were followed around by cameras for 48 hours continuously, just talking to this other person and watching them and in their lab, in their environment. So for me, I got to go to Puerto Rico, which was great. And then we would be visited by another. So I was visited by a physicist from Colorado called Yun, and he built atomic clocks. In fact, he built what was at the time the world's most accurate, precise atomic clock. And so he was interested in time and in measurement. And one of the things that we do in my lab with my colleague Warwick Roseboom is we look at the brain basis of time perception. How do we as human beings experience the flow of time? And if you think about it, it's a really weird aspect of perception because we don't have time sensors. We have cells in our eyes to see, we have hair cells in our ears to register vibrations in the air, pressure sensors for touch. We don't have time sensors in our brains, and we don't really even have clocks in our brains, although this is debated in the field. But we nonetheless have a very rich sense of duration, of time passing, of now, of present and past. How does the brain construct the experience of time? So I think as a film, it worked really well because we were sort of discussing some of these really fundamental questions from very different directions.
That's right. I watched that whole series. Yeah, it was interesting. It is on Netflix, yeah, or Amazon Prime. Anyway, you can see it here in the States. Yeah, so the passage of time thing, yeah, that's interesting because aren't there like biological clocks, so to speak, the circadian rhythm, a sense that an evolved species on a planet with a 24-hour day is going to have some kind of general cycle of how its body and physiology responds to light and dark and so forth. And that can be tweaked, like the guy that put himself in a cave for a year or whatever it was, and it totally messed up his circadian rhythms. So there must be some, it's probably another one of these processes that just emerges at some level that without a specific organ that keeps track of it or whatever. I also think another problem we have is that we can't sense our own brain working, but it feels like there's thoughts floating around in my head. And it feels like a mind that's not physical. It just feels like it could float off and go somewhere. And when I die, it floats off and goes somewhere. I have a soul. That's what it feels like. It's kind of that intuitive dualism. I think Paul Bloom calls us natural-born dualists. And in his lab, developmental lab, children, pretty young age, kind of project like the little baby alligator that munches the baby mouse in the puppet show. And these children think, well, the mouse, where's the mouse? Well, the mouse is with its mommy now, and it's hungry, whatever. These young children still project, even though the mouse body is there, but the mouse essence went somewhere. And that's kind of how it feels, right? So, when people experience paranormal, supernatural phenomena, just anomalous psychological experiences, out-of-body experiences, near-death experiences, they really experience them as if it's out there because you have no sense of what's going on up here, right? So that complicates this problem even further because we have this word, mind, it feels separate from brain.
I like that way of putting it, that we're not generally aware of what's going on in our brains. We're not. I mean, we get headaches and things like that, but they're very poor indicators of what's actually happening under the skull. And you're also right that there is this intuitive appeal to dualism. It seems as if our minds are non-physical. But there was also this intuitive vitalism back to the beginning of biology. In fact, even now, if you ask school children about what life is, you'll find, and you phrase the question the right way, some version of vitalism is still fairly intuitive. But the history of science has just told us over and over again, as you'll know, that like how things seem is not a very good guide to how they are. And there's this beautiful quote that I love from Ludwig Wittgenstein and Elizabeth Anscombe, his colleague and biographer. And they're walking in the garden one day, and I'll try to paraphrase it, but I think Wittgenstein just says, so why did people at one point think that the sun rotated around the earth rather than the earth spinning on its axis to give us day and night? And Anscombe says, well, I guess because it looks as if the sun goes around the earth. And Wittgenstein says, okay, but what would it look like if it looked as if the earth was spinning on its axis?
The same.
And I love that because, of course, it looks exactly the same, right, but not.
Right.
And I think the same thing applies. That's the motif that I've tried to take to all the aspects of consciousness that I'm interested in. It seems as if colors exist as a mind-independent property of the world. But the fact they seem that way doesn't mean that they are that way, and in fact, they're not that way. And it seems as if, back to your point, that mind, consciousness, is non-physical in some way. but then to do a Wittgenstein on it, well, what would it seem like if it seemed as if mind was a physical phenomenon?
The same.
Maybe it would seem exactly the way that it already does.
Yeah, yeah. I mean, I run into this problem all the time with what I do for a living in skepticism, is that, people have these personal experiences, and they're very powerful. I was abducted by aliens, or I came out of my body. I did a show with Eben Alexander, the Harvard-trained neurologist who wrote this book, Proof of Heaven. And, he was in a coma from a viral infection of his brain, and they put him in an induced coma to get the swelling down and so forth. And apparently when they were bringing him out, he had this trip. He went to heaven. And so he wrote all about it quite vividly. But when I read it, to me, it's no different than when I read Oliver Sacks's accounts of people having these fantastic, amazing hallucinations and experiences, including himself. He writes about this in his memoir of when he was in medical school, pulling 80-hour weeks and taking all kinds of meds to keep going and having these amazing hallucinations that look a lot like that video you play in your TED Talk of the sort of controlled hallucination thing. That's how Sacks describes it. And of course, Sacks says, this is all chemistry. I wasn't going anywhere. And, I think one of them was he got on a bus and everybody there was a proboscis, like a giant fly or whatever. He goes, of course, I know that's not real. I didn't go anywhere. This is all in my head. But someone like Eben Alexander, who's, a scientist, he says, I know all that stuff, Shermer, all this stuff about out-of-body experiences and it's oxygen deprivation, blah, blah, blah. But it was so powerful. I really went somewhere. And I'm told, I've never done ayahuasca, but I'm told that, something like 90% of ayahuasca users, they really feel like there is this other world, this other dimension that's out there. And the only way, so if I say, well, where's the evidence for it? They go, well, here, take the ayahuasca, you'll see the evidence. But to me, that's like, from a scientific perspective, well, but that's just personal. That's kind of a personal truth. It's true for me, but how can I show you without the ayahuasca that place is really there? Now, apparently some people who take it go, yeah, I know it's just a trip. But for most people, those experiences are so powerful, they can't imagine it's just chemistry.
That's right. Actually, I think the experience of the vivid experience of going somewhere to other dimensions is, I think that more comes along with when people inhale DMT rather than the ayahuasca, which is the tea with the same thing in,
right,
which typically doesn't give that sort of, you're blasted out of reality as it is into another world. The brewed version, which I have tried. I haven't tried the inhaling one. That doesn't blast you into a different reality, but it still definitely distorts your sense of what's going on and what's around you. But the general point you make, I think, is really, really well put. And it's also very delicate. And I think you probably have a lot more experience of this than me. So when people report things like out-of-body experiences or near-death experiences or being in another reality, of course, it's a mistake to deny, the reality of that experience for them. It's, as you say, it's their personal truth. And also the meaning of that experience for them. These experiences of out-of-body journeys or near-death experiences can be extremely meaningful in somebody's life. So I don't think it's really helpful to sort of say, oh no, but it's all just, your visual cortex is shutting down, so that completely explains what's happening. It's a difficult thing to say. But of course, that probably is what's happening. And where I think you and I share the skeptical perspective is in making the leap from what the experience, which is real for them, is like, to some bigger claim about the nature of reality. So going from, I have an out-of-body experience, therefore my soul, my personality, my mind can in fact leave my body, rather than the more naturalistic explanation that, no, something has happened in your brain such that your brain has reached a different conclusion about where your first-person perspective is located. That will account for the same experience, but in a different way. But of course, if that experience means something very deeply to that person, I think, and I wonder how you deal with this, because you talk to these people all the time trying to put the skeptical perspective. How directly can you confront, and do you just run up against a wall of denial because believing the opposite is so important to that person's network of other beliefs?
Yes, well, you'd be respectful, and most of the people I meet, I think, really do have these experiences. I don't think they make stuff up just to sell books or whatever. And so you start off by acknowledging the experience is real. The question is, what does it represent? Something in here or something out there? So here's two hypotheses. Your hypothesis that it's out there somewhere and I'm going somewhere. Oh, and the scientific hypothesis is that it's all up here. And then you can just sort of run through the evidence and say what's more likely. So like with someone like Deepak, like I asked him famously, and I wrote about this in one of my Scientific American columns, where does Aunt Millie's mind go when it dies of dementia or Alzheimer's? The neurons are just dying and her memory fades. Her sense of self is slowly dissolving away till the point where she doesn't know who anybody is in the room, doesn't even know who she is. And then death comes. Where does that mind go if it's not tied to the neurons? And Deepak's answer is, well, the neurons are like the radio. The radio signals are in the room, but you need the radio apparatus to pick them up. So it's like that. To which I say, well, but we know where radio stations are located and they're broadcasting. Where's the consciousness broadcaster in the universe, right? And Deepak's answer is, well, it's sort of a theological answer. It's the ground of all being. It's like Tillich's definition of God. It's the ground of all being. It's everywhere. You can't get underneath it. There's no drilling down. It's not in the quarks or whatever. It just is. And to me, it seems like we end up at an epistemological wall. At some point, we can't even talk anymore because that's the end of the conversation. When you say it's everywhere, it's everything, like panpsychism, it's everything. Or Chalmers, we could be living in a virtual world right now. How do you know? Is there a way to test it? No. Okay. Then how do we get an answer to that question? I don't know.
Yeah, I think the value of a theoretical approach or even a philosophical approach is the degree to which it provides insight into things. And if you just bottom out at a level of explanation that's taken to be fundamental, and that happens before you've explained the interesting things you want to explain, such as in consciousness again, like why do I experience vision this way, emotion that way, what's the experience of free will all about, why do I have a self? Unless you can come up with answers for these questions, then I think you're backing the wrong horse because your explanatory power has run out of steam before it's got to these questions. And this is the issue I have with panpsychism, that it's not that it's crazy. I mean, a lot of crazy ideas in the end turn out to be true. And quantum mechanics is frankly nuts, but it gives a lot of explanatory and predictive insight. That panpsychism, for me, this hypothesis that consciousness is fundamental at the same level as mass or energy, doesn't really give you any explanatory leverage over anything. The only potential explanatory leverage it gives you is a sort of false feeling of, okay, I don't have to worry about the hard problem anymore because consciousness is just built in from the ground up. But if I want to know why does my experience of making a voluntary action feel the way it does, then I don't think you have any answer in panpsychism. I think the only elaboration of panpsychism is that you have this combination problem, like why do you get big conscious things out of little conscious things sometimes and not other times? And that's an interesting question, but it's a question that only makes sense within the context of panpsychism. It's a problem that wouldn't exist and if you don't take the panpsychism view to start with.
What is the fascination with quantum physics and consciousness? Is it just because they're both kind of spooky and weird, so it feels like they might be connected some way? Like the double slit experiment, it seems like
that's a tempting way to put it.
Yeah. Say it again.
Yeah, I mean, the tempting way to think about it, and kind of the cheap shot really, isn't it? That both consciousness and quantum mechanics are mysterious, so they must have something to do with each other. And to some extent, I think that characterizes some of the approaches between quantum theory A, quantum theory B, and consciousness. But we can give it a little bit more, I think, headroom than that. I mean, fundamentally, quantum mechanics remains our best theory of matter at the sort of scale in which we exist, in which brains exist, right? So we are quantum mechanical beings at that level. But does quantum mechanics offer anything specific to help us explain consciousness? Now, there's this emerging field of quantum biology. I know you talked about this with my friend Jim Al-Khalili recently, who's pioneering in this field. And it's absolutely fascinating. There do seem to be some effects in biology that take specific advantages of quantum properties. So photosynthesis, I think, is a famous example, but there may be other examples where we need to appeal to quantum mechanics to explain something in biology. Actually, the mechanism of action of anaesthesia might be another one. It might be that to understand exactly how molecules of anesthetics bind to their targets and so on might be something that requires a quantum biological explanation. But does that mean that quantum mechanics explains consciousness? No, I don't think it does. It's just a sort of elaboration of chemistry here. I think there's still a temptation to equate the mysteries. The way I've come to see it now is actually a little bit more positively. And this is often in arguments with people, panpsychists and people who claim that materialism, the thesis that consciousness is ultimately a property instantiated by matter in certain organization, who claim that that's not sufficient, that the materialism just isn't up to the job. There's no way to imagine a materialistic explanation of consciousness. This motivates the whole zombie argument in philosophy that you can just anyways, I think a lot of that suspicion, you can think, well, that's because maybe we have an overly simplistic view of what matter is. Matter turns out to be incredibly rich and complicated, and quantum mechanics is an incredibly valuable insight into this. And there are still, as you know, there are still complete disagreements about how to interpret quantum mechanics. What does it mean? Is it many worlds, right? Are there quantum fields? Is, as I feel personally attracted to, though I'm no expert, Carlo Rovelli's views of relational quantum mechanics, that fundamentally matter is relational rather than being sort of properties that exist at a point. And if you think, okay, matter can have lots of interesting properties, then maybe the scope of materialistic explanation is broader, wider, vaster than we think. And this isn't the same as using quantum mechanics to magic a solution to the hard problem of consciousness. I just haven't seen anything in that realm that is convincing.
Yeah.
It does seem in that sense a bit of an easy out to the hard problem.
Yes, but to be fair, the double slit experiment is pretty spooky, that somehow these particles are interacting and they could be a galaxy apart, 100,000 light years away. And how is that? And they instantly communicate. This is what bothered Einstein so much, the spooky action at a distance. So there are legitimate mysteries that, perhaps we'll get at one day. I wanted to see, just on a technical point.
Just to linger on that for one little bit longer, because I think the other confusion, the other issue that often comes in the quantum discussion is the observer effect. So there's I think in a lot of interpretations, especially in the Copenhagen interpretation, there's this idea that the observer collapses the wave function. And often that's conflated with the idea that, it's the conscious observer that collapses the wave function. And indeed, some interpretations of quantum mechanics, I think it's the von Neumann-Wigner interpretation, really explicitly say this. But it's a pretty minority view for which there doesn't seem to be any good evidence. And I think, to my limited knowledge, observation in quantum physics is better treated as the interaction of objects at very different scales. But again, it does depend which of the interpretations you talk about. But that's another way that the consciousness argument has an apparent relevance to quantum mechanics that it might not have. Right.
As I understand it, the observer can be a camera or just any device that measures photons or whatever. That takes the consciousness out of it. I forgot to mention I had Fritjof Capra on the show too, because he also deals with this. I loved his book, The Tao of Physics, and the Turning Point and all that stuff. All that was big fun back in the 80s. But again, it really didn't generate a working paradigm for scientists to test hypotheses. It's, again, kind of in that metaphysical realm. Just a technical question, since you mentioned red. So this redness or pinkness or whatever this is, it's my new SIM card to get the 5G for my phone. So obviously a bee or a bat or somebody would see a different color than I see. So color is one thing, but the shape, this kind of rectangular shape, it's narrow. I can tell that with my fingers. I could see it with my eyes. Doesn't that have a different set of properties that is more real than, say, color?
Yes, I think the answer to that is fairly clear. I talk about color a lot because I think it is a really nice example of how what we experience is both less than and more than what's there. Our eyes are only sensitive to a tiny fraction of the electromagnetic spectrum. We have, unless we're colorblind or most people have 3 color sensitive cells in their eye, 3 types of cells, and out of those 3 types of cells, we generate this huge universe of color. But color is what I think it was John Locke who made this distinction, a secondary quality. It really does require a mind to exist. But there are also primary qualities, things like solidity and speed and potentially shape. Although here I'm a bit less, I think there's this is debatable, but there are certainly some things which in this defensible sense are more real than others. And so after I gave my TED talk, which had the slightly unfortunate title, "You Hallucinate Your Conscious Reality," without the word control in there, I got endless emails telling me to go and stand in front of a train and see if you hallucinate that. And of course, no, that's the train exists and it's going to hit me and hurt, no matter whether I'm looking at it or not. The train has these properties of solidity and speed, which don't depend on whether I'm looking at it or not. However, when I look at the train, my experience of speed, of how fast the train is going, my experience of whether it's solid or not, that's always a construction. So I tend to reside with Kant on this, that we never experience reality as it really is. Everything we experience is a construction. There is this sensory veil that hides the noumenon, the nature of reality, from our experience. But our experience is mostly very closely tied to what's there. But it's tied to what's there not by a criterion of accuracy, but by a criterion of how useful a particular way of experiencing the world is for our prospects of survival. Colors are not the most accurate way to experience the world. And they vary by species a lot because there are different adaptive constraints that shape how different species should best construct color from colorless lights in order to survive. And of course, complex interactions between species. Flowers have colors because they co-evolved with bees and other insects. And we see that flowers and petals have colors, but not in the same way that bees do. But yes, some things are more real than others, but we never see reality as it really is. That would be
so the question
summary of my view.
Excuse me, how far you want to go with that? I forgot I had Donald Hoffman on the show with his interface theory of perception, in which he pushes this hypothesis pretty far, to which I'm a little skeptical of going that far. That is to say, it's all an interface, like the trash can symbol on your screen. There's no trash can in the laptop. It's all like that. But it seems to me like even though whatever the bat sees when it sees this coffee mug, I'm sure it's different than what I see. But there really is a mug there, and the bat, if it approaches, it's going to go around it so it doesn't hit it because it uses sonar instead of sight. Okay, but and the map in its brain of that cup is going to be different than my map. But there really is a cup, and he's really going to avoid it because there is a reality. There is a universal. Call it universal realism. There's a real world out there. Admittedly, we don't have 100% vertical perception, but it's not 0% either, right? There has to be some mapping. Exactly. Sort of a correspondence theory of truth. There has to be some correspondence between the senses that gets us closer to reality.
Yeah, I completely agree. And I think Don Hoffman and I, we've had a number of conversations, we do agree up definitely to that point that what we perceive is not a direct reflection of what's there, but it is closely related, and it's related in ways that are tuned to our environmental prospects. It's tuned to help us guide our survival, guide our behavior very, very broadly. But he does so, and I think then we go further, but in different directions. So for me, the interesting question is how deep into the structure of phenomenal subjective experience can we go? So yes, colors are constructed in this way. Primary qualities like the shape of something? Well, in a sense, when I look at a three-dimensional object like this mug in front of me of tea, I experience the back of this mug even though I'm not directly seeing it. That to me is part of the experience of shape, but it's also a construction that my brain is making on the basis of sensory data that it's inferring, or my view on this, which sort of inherits from people like Alvin Noe and Kevin O'Regan, that I experience this object as having three-dimensional shape because my brain is inferring what would happen to the sensory data were I to rotate it or move behind it. So I think we can explain the experience of shape is also an interesting kind of construction. And then what about the experience of time we briefly touched on? I think much the same thing applies there. We construct time from other aspects of experience, from the rate of change in our other perceptual modalities is the working hypothesis that we have in the lab here. So how deep can we go? And ultimately, the experience of things as being real. When does the brain experience something as really existing? Because that's not always the case. If you look at the sun and then look away very quickly, you'll have an after image, and you don't experience that as being really part of the world. If you're lucid dreaming, you know that it's not part of the world. If you're on certain psychedelic drugs, you know that your experiences are not part of the world. So there's a phenomenal property which is exactly the property of when something is experienced as being real. And I think that, again, back to our point, like we don't just take it for granted those things experienced as real are and those aren't. No, what explains the nature of that experience? Don takes it in a different way. I think he sort of goes from this indirectness of perception to claims about the nature of reality and the existence of conscious agents and some form of panpsychism. I don't go that direction with the argument. I don't think it follows. I think it's an interesting way to take it, but we don't align on that.
Yeah. Right. I liked your chapter on Bayesian reasoning because I like Bayesian reasoning as an approach to evaluating claims of any kind, especially extraordinary claims, require extraordinary evidence. It's kind of a Bayesian argument. And if I recall, because it's been a while since I read your book, you're arguing that the brain is like a Bayesian calculator, and we're constantly updating our priors and making predictions. So with experience, you know that the back of the mug is going to be similar to the front of the mug in its shape because your brain has experienced, 10,000 experiences of touching the back, and it's the same as the front and so on. So it's constantly updating. So that would be kind of like a neuronal Bayesian process. And so the brain is trying to correspond its different senses to a real world and get a more accurate picture, even though it's never going to be 100%. Something like that?
Yeah, exactly. So the whole idea of Bayesian inference, Bayesian reasoning, I think is a useful formalization and formalism of the problem of perception. You can think of the problem of perception at a first approximation as how does the brain figure out what's going on in the world on the basis of ambiguous and noisy sensory data that doesn't come with labels on that I'm from a coffee cup or a cat, whatever. And that's the classic problem that Bayesian reasoning is well equipped to solve, that you have uncertainty. You're trying to reason with uncertainty. You have some data, and you have to reach your best guess about what that data means, what caused that data. But it's sort of inverse reasoning. So you're going from observed data to the potential cause of that data. And Bayesian reasoning does this by saying, okay, what do I already believe? These are my priors, the prior beliefs. And then you have new data. And then how do I update my priors in the face of new data? And you get the posterior belief in the terms of Bayes, which is intuitively, it's just what should I believe now, given what I believed before and this new data. So this is a nice way to formalize the problem. And then there's been endless discussion in neuroscience about whether the brain is Bayesian or not, because you can always find examples where actually what we do either does or does not align with the predictions that Bayes would make. But of course, the predictions that Bayes would make depend on the priors that you choose. If you choose different priors, you can basically explain anything in terms of as Bayes optimal. The more interesting thing for me is, okay, it's a useful formalism, but what is the brain actually doing? Because to actually solve the equations of Bayesian inference is very, very complicated, and it's not something that's easy to figure out how a brain might do it. And this is where we bring up this whole idea of predictive coding or predictive processing, or the controlled hallucination view, which I talk about in the book. And this is this idea that the brain is constantly making predictions about the causes of sensory data that flow from the top down or the inside out. And the sensory data serve as prediction errors, which serve to update the predictions, to calibrate them, to keep them tuned to what's out there in the world. And as the brain continually tries to minimize prediction error by updating its predictions or by making actions to get new data, that's, in fact, what it's doing is approximating Bayesian inference. So this whole repeated cycle of prediction and prediction error and updating predictions, if you run that cycle, what you get is Bayesian inference. And so now I think there's a nice connection. What we have is what we can call a process theory of what brains are doing. What the neural architecture of the brain is doing, so this theory suggests, is this process of predictive processing. Top-down predictions, bottom-up prediction errors, largely. On the one hand, that allows us to say how perception works. And on the other hand, it allows us to make claims about why certain experiences are the way they are. Because now, from this view, if the sensory signals are mainly serving as prediction errors, it makes more sense to think of the content of what we perceive as inherent in the predictions. So the brain's actual best guess about what's going on. It's not that perception is reading out sensory signals from the inside out, from the outside in, or the bottom up. Perceptual content in this view is the brain's predictions that flow from the inside out or the top down that are calibrated by the prediction errors. And then we can use that basic framework to then explain different kinds of perceptual experience, do experiments about how our brain's expectations change what we see. And that's what I try to do, and take it all the way through experiences of the world around us to experiences of the self. So the experience of being me or being you, in this view, is another set of perceptual predictions, but in this case, the sensory data come from within the body, and the purpose of the predictions is not to figure out what's there. My brain doesn't care where my internal organs are, it cares that they're working properly. So the purpose of predictions is to regulate the internal physiology. And if you think about it, that sheds light immediately on the experience of my body is mainly things like emotions and moods. Things are going well or badly. That would be the content of a prediction that's used to control things. Whereas a visual prediction is typically objects in various places. And that's because vision is typically about figuring out what's there, not so much controlling things, though there are interesting counterexamples in both directions. And this, for me, illustrates the richness of this framework, that it can tell you why experiences are the way they are. That is, I think, the bread and butter of what consciousness science should be about. And the controlled hallucination view, it's not a theory of consciousness in the sense that it's saying, when you have predictive processing, you have consciousness. It's a rich language we can use to build bridges between descriptions of phenomenology and descriptions of what's happening inside the brain and the body.
Yeah. Yeah, I really like that, because to me it shows that humans are not hopelessly irrational and just totally subject to cognitive biases and emotions and tribal ideologies and so on, that we can reason our way to an understanding of the world, but not perfectly. So we need the tools of science, rationality, all the list of cognitive biases that we should look out for. And so I was thinking about this with this image. I'll use it up from the phone, the checkerboard illusion. That doesn't come out very good.
Yes.
It's in your book there. That's a little bit better. So, yep. Everybody thinks that the two squares A and B are different, and then you put the gray bars on there and they say, oh, they're the same. And so if people are like, oh boy, I really got fooled. But you didn't really I don't think it's being fooled so much as if you actually saw that setup in the physical world, and it wasn't done by a perceptual psychologist or a magician, it wouldn't, the two squares would be different colors. That is how the world really works, and that you have to trick people. It reminds me of all these sort of guerrilla theater social psych experiments in the 60s and 70s of like smoke in the room, and everybody in the room is a shill, and they're just filling out their form, and the subject sits there even though theater smoke is being pumped into the room, and they continue to fill out the form, looking back and forth. Well, no one's doing anything, so I guess I won't either. Ha ha ha. They're just falling for the crowd and conformity and all that. But really, normally, if there was a fire, people would do something. And if people weren't doing something, the people you trust, your social group, if they weren't doing anything, probably that's a signal that there's nothing to worry about, right? So really, a lot of these psych experiments to me they're kind of tricking people to show how it normally works, right? So we're not hopelessly walking around in a hallucination. So you call it a controlled hallucination. So it could be a hallucination, but we're actually able to get at and control it and get at what the real world is really like.
Well, I think we can get at not the way the world is really like, but we certainly get at regularities in the real world that are meaningful to us. So it's really not arbitrary. And I think that's the important thing. I actually am not sure about your criticism of the checkerboard example. I think it's criticizable from another angle, actually. So I mean, imagine you said like if it's in the real world, you would see that they're the same color. I don't think that's true. I think you would actually see there would be. I mean, you would see they're the same color. I think you're right to say that. But the reason you would see that is because you'd probably be moving around the board, and you'd see it as a checkerboard, right? And the illusion works because you constrain the perspective to a particular way where the shadows fall in a particular way so that the squares look to be different colors. But I think the real lesson here is that our visual systems are doing exactly what they're supposed to do, even when you see the illusion. Because when you look at the illusion, what you see is a checkerboard, right? That's what you see. And that's your visual system working perfectly. It's not a light meter. It's not trying to figure out the luminance or the exact chromaticity of light that's hitting your eye. It's trying to figure out what's out there in the world that is giving rise to the sensations that hit your eye. And it reaches the conclusion that it's a checkerboard. And that's exactly the right conclusion for it to reach.
Yeah.
So I think it's a really example that it's doing what it should do.
It's a little bit like those three-dimensional models that people have built of like M.C. Escher paintings, where the water is impossibly moving upwards up this canal and so forth. But those have to be seen from a very specific angle. Otherwise, because if you moved around it, you'd see, oh, it's a trick. They're doing this and that with the angles and so forth.
Yeah, exactly. I mean, these things work when they're set up in particular ways. I think the example that I also often use is that photo of the dress, the one that half the world saw as blue and black and half the world saw as white and gold. And the reason that works is because it's a really unusual photograph. It's taken so that the context of the dress is very ambiguous. You can't really see what kind of ambient lighting conditions it's in. If you saw the dress in real life, it's very, very clearly blue and black, and there's no ambiguity about it at all. So you have to restrict the amount of contextual information available to the brain in order to get these kinds of effects. And I think most visual illusions work that way. They're always manipulations of context in ways that we find weird, because we don't understand that what we see should be influenced by context. It's not that context biases things away from the truth. Context is helping the brain get at what the world is really like.
Oh, yeah. You had this image in the book. And I forget what it is now, if you explain what it is. But
well, this is an example of what's called a Moonie image, or a two-tone image. So what people should do is just look at it, and just look at it for a second, and it probably doesn't look like much. It just looks like a bunch of black and white splodges. But then if you turn to another image, which is a few pages later on, I don't know the page number, but if you flip a few pages forward, you'll see another image,
The horse?
Exactly, which I don't know if this is visible. Yeah, it's just about visible.
Right.
It's probably not working through the screen, but
there we go.
Yeah, it's an image of a woman with a hat on the right, kissing a horse on the left. And if you look at that for a little bit, and then you flip back to the first image, the two-tone image, it works a lot better like on the screen. You can alternate back and forth.
I see it.
But now you see it. Now you can see exactly. So I think the fascinating thing about this is that you're looking at the set for the two-tone image. It's the photo, but it's been massively thresholded, so it just becomes black and white at the extremes. It's the same sensory data both times, but the second time you see it, your brain has become equipped with a prior expectation about what caused that image. And that prior expectation, that changes instantly the subjective experience of looking at that image, whereas they were just random splodges of black and white. There are objects, there are actions, there's a scene happening there. And it's anecdotal, so you can do nice experiments with this about showing how, indeed, after you've seen the second image, how the dynamics of the brain are different when they're exposed to the first image again, and how that correlates with people's ability to recognize the image. But it's just, again, I think a fascinating window onto the fact that what we experience isn't just given by the sensory data. It's always what the brain's interpretation of that sensory data is.
Although here, when the image is degraded and you can't quite make out what you're seeing, then the expectations or the primes that somebody gives you fills it in, nudges you one way or the other. It's the old woman, the young woman, the rabbit or the duck or whatever. I use this example in my book, The Believing Brain, of Galileo and the rings of Saturn. So he didn't know what the rings of Saturn were because there's no theory of planetary rings. So he famously let me see if I can show that there, in his own text, he just kind of drew in a couple of different things he saw. One was a big planet with two ears, and another one was kind of an oblong planet. And so that was 1609, 1610, and it wasn't until Christian Huygens in, 1659 published his book on Saturn there, in which he cataloged all the different theories of what different astronomers thought they were seeing. And then finally it's clear with bigger telescopes, it's a planetary ring. And once you know it's a ring, then it's like all the other things just disappear, right? So, but that kind of, the power of expectation or prime only works when you can't quite make out what it is you're seeing, right? And if you don't already have a theory of what you're supposed to be seeing, that's when different theories kind of fill in those blanks.
I think that's when it can become very obvious as an example. But the claim is, of course, that that's what's happening all the time. Mm-hmm. It's just that it's so seamless most of the time that we don't notice it. Mm. But all the time, all our experiences are built from these expectations. But they work. And there's very rarely situations where the sensory data will stay the same and our expectations will massively change. And then we'll see something different. But this does happen in normal life as well. You walk out in the morning and it's misty and you're hoping to meet a friend and you really see somebody else, and then you get closer and you realize that you've been talking to a stranger. But again, there the data are ambiguous. So it becomes obvious that your expectations are having an effect. But even when it's not obvious to you, that's still going on. By the way, I love those examples of Saturn's rings. It makes me think of a similar thing happened in neuroscience, of course, right? With Golgi and Santiago Ramón y Cajal. And this whole idea of, are neurons connected into a single mesh, a reticulum, or are they separated and individual? And Golgi had developed a lot of the equipment to look, to stain these cells, to get the data, but had such a strong prior expectation that his reticular theory was correct that he kept drawing them as networks. He never saw that they were separate. And Santiago Ramón y Cajal, initially trained as an artist, had the ability to get underneath his expectations a bit more and draw what he saw through the microscope and realize that neurons were in fact individual cells that were not physically connected into a network. And of course, Ramón y Cajal was right and Golgi was wrong. And they both had the same data.
Mm-hmm. Right, but at that moment in time, it wasn't clear. Now it is clear. So when you say one was right and the other was wrong, uh, we can kind of bank our investments in confidence and knowledge that that is the case, right? It's not like a postmodern, well, that's what we think now in the year 2022, but 1,000 years from now, it may turn out that neurons are completely different. That seems unlikely to me.
Yeah, I think so. I think that's settled fact. But I think the point was that sometimes before that point of settled knowledge is reached,
right?
If you strongly believe something and you happen to be right, then that's great, because then you'll have seen patterns in data that other people won't have seen, and those patterns will turn out in the fullness of time, if you're lucky, to reflect the way the world is and become obvious to everybody. But if you're wrong, then you'll end up backing a wrong horse, and you'll have seen patterns that don't reflect the way the world is. And as the technology develops and as the data come in more and more, then you'll be wrong. And that's what happened to Golgi.
Do you think that that's where we're at right now with the problem of consciousness, and that a century or two from now, people go, oh, look at those 20 different crazy theories they had. Now we know this is the right one.
It's such a difficult question to answer. It might be a matter of data. So there is this, we already talked about how brain imaging was a real catalyst, but it's still extremely limited. Right? We can use fMRI, and we're not looking at neurons when we use this dominant technology of functional magnetic resonance imaging. We're looking at a signature of blood oxygenation, which is related to metabolism, which is indirectly related to what large numbers of neurons are doing. Even methods like EEG or MEG, magnetoencephalography, they record more directly the activity of neurons, but only over large populations. It's a little like dangling a microphone above a city and trying to work out what people are saying from the rumbles of noise. We can record from single neurons with implanted electrodes, but only very, very few. Even if Elon Musk and Neuralink are massively successful, we're not going to be able to record from all the neurons in the human brain. So imaging is limited. We have no method on the horizon that will give us both temporal, spatial resolution and granularity and coverage of everything. We can do like one or one and a bit at most. What would that do? I think it would allow us to really refine the theories that we have and discriminate among them. There's a lot of activity now in the field of consciousness research where there are a number of prominent theories, and these are some of the theories that we review in this review paper on the theories of consciousness. And they all try to explain different aspects of consciousness, and they often have different assumptions, and they're difficult to directly compare in the way that, for instance, in the history of science, Newton and Einstein could be compared on the basis of a single experiment about light grazing the surface of the sun. How much is it bent? The theories of consciousness we have aren't really like that. So it's a challenge in itself to figure out what are the sorts of experiments that would distinguish between these theories, even if no experiment is going to confirm, fully validate any theory. I don't think we're there yet, but we are moving to the point as a field where people are thinking about these so-called adversarial collaborations. So groups of people from different theoretical perspectives getting together to figure out what would be the experiment to do that would best distinguish these experiments, and then signing up in advance to say, if the data came out this way, then I'm happy, and if the data come out this way, then I'm unhappy. And I think this is a real advance. And interestingly, it's not just an advance in data collection ability or technology, but more in the structure of how science is done. There's all these movements in open science now that people should pre-register their experiments, say in advance what hypotheses they're going to test, rather than just digging around in the data to see what they can find. That mechanism allows people to do these kinds of collaborations, to say, yeah, from this theory, this is what I expect, and I'm going to just sign that now, and let's see. And there are a few of these collaborations getting going. I'm involved in one of them quite loosely about predictive processing and integrated information theory. And there are some fascinating experiments that are being planned that are not going to reveal the theory of consciousness, but they will heavily weigh in favor or against these two theories.
Interesting. Good.
So where will we be in 50 years or 100 years? I don't know. I don't think we'll have... So I would be very surprised if in 100 years we have a solution to the challenge of consciousness in the form we might want to have it now, as a solution to the hard problem. In the same way that biologists 150 years ago might have wanted to know, what is the élan vital? But what I do think is that in 150 years, 100 years, we will know a lot more about consciousness than we do and its brain basis. And more importantly, I think we'll have come to think of the problem differently. Because progress in science is as much about changing the questions that you're asking as it is about finding answers to the questions that you had. And I think that's going to describe a lot of the trajectory of the science of consciousness to come.
Yeah. Let me just ask you a last few big questions. What do you think happens when we die? Where does our consciousness go? Or, that's probably the wrong question, right? It would just be, what happens to consciousness? Or how do you think about that?
I think, with humility, because I haven't died and I haven't been right up against it yet either in my life, that I think it goes away. I think it is a process that stops processing. We're changing all the time anyway. What it is to be me now is different from what it was to be me actually even 6 months ago, because I've been suffering from long COVID for the past few months. And so the experience of being who I am really does feel different from what it did before all this. But yeah, I think when life comes to an end, consciousness stops in the same way, or that it goes away in the most profound general anesthesia. Mm-hmm. But of course, from death, there's no coming back.
Right, you just don't wake up again. Anything to the idea of uploading your connectome, all your synaptic map of everything, all your memories into the cloud and turning it on, and you'd wake up there?
No, not really. Not for me. I think it's a bit of a techno-utopian myth, or even dystopian myth, frankly. It makes so many assumptions that I think the most fundamental assumption that it makes is that consciousness is independent of the substrate, that you can just abstract away at some level. We don't know which level. Is it the synapses? Is it the activity of the neurons? Is it do you need the neurotransmitters as well? What do you need? But that it's something you can reinstantiate in simulation. Now, this may be true. It's very, very popular view in philosophy of consciousness is functionalism, that indeed consciousness is substrate independent. You can just you get the functional relations right, you can make consciousness out of tin cans strung together in the right way. But I don't see a strong reason to believe that. I think it's an open question, and there's, I think, some positive reasons to think that consciousness is dependent on the stuff we're made of, and this is partly because there's no clear distinction in biological systems like the brain between the mindware and the wetware, as there is in a computer between the hardware and the software. You can go down to neurons, you can go below neurons. Where do you draw the line? So I don't think there's much of that. Plus, it's just, you upload to the cloud in some way. What exactly are you uploading? It's a process that involves this dance between changing structure, change the dynamics, changes the structure changes the dynamics. We're embodied, we're embedded. I don't think it's likely to happen.
On the nature of the self, I get the argument it's an illusion because we're constantly changing. We're stepping into the same river twice every second, and it's constantly changing. Okay, but is there not kind of a core set of characteristics that represents you? And although think of it as like a channel, and while you can kind of bump around in the channel, there's sort of a core set of characteristics of your personality, your temperament, your memories, and so on that reaches back to your first memories to today, right now. And something like Theseus's ship, you're constantly changing the wood, so the material stuff of the ship's not the same. But we still think of it, well, it's still the ship because it's the shape, the information that still exists.
Yeah, I think that's a good way to put it. So we're processed a little bit like in this metaphor, a bit like a river, right? It keeps flowing, it changes a little bit. the banks change, the shape of the banks change, but there's some fundamental identity that persists. And I think that's right. I think there is a continuity. I think we tend to overestimate that continuity, but that doesn't mean that it's totally illusory. There's good reason that the brain should work that way, to have some stability, some continuity is a useful anchor for regulation of the self. To experience ourselves as stable helps keep us stable, and keeping our bodies, our physiology stable is, for me, the ground of all selfhood and what brains evolved to do. But it's not a necessary feature of self, because we know examples where there are massive breaks in people's personality, often as the result of brain damage or some very severe psychiatric illness. People's personalities can dramatically change. Their character can completely alter. It's just, fortunately for most of us, most of the time, that doesn't happen.
Mm-hmm. Okay, nature of self and then the nature of others. How do we know other people are sentient and conscious? They're not just zombies. Would something like the Copernican principle apply to yourself work as an explanation? That is, I'm not special. So if I see in your face the expression of anger or sadness or depression, and I've seen that in my own face, and I know what I feel, so it's reasonable to assume you're probably feeling the same thing. And then your Bayesian argument, I experience this with thousands of other people, and that kind of updates my priors. Yes, they probably are experiencing the same thing as me. It's reasonable to assume that they're the same as me or similar to me.
Yeah, I think similar is fair enough. I think that's probably as far as most of us would want to go, rather than exactly the same. I think the idea of, do we know other people are conscious, is relatively easy to answer. Of course, we don't know for 100% absolute sure. It's possible to imagine a world where maybe that's not true, but it's so unlikely, right? We share so much in terms of what's inside, what's outside. It's a very unreasonable inference to reach a conclusion that I'm the only conscious person in the world. But then the degree to which we have similar experiences, actually, this is something I'm currently very interested in. I mean, we know that it's not completely true, and we've already talked about some examples of that photo of the dress. People have very different experience for the same object. People with synesthesia have different experiences. People with autism have different experiences. But my suspicion here is that there's a lot of variability in our lived experience that we just overlook because it's not dramatic enough that it becomes a social media meme or a condition with a name. So if I look at the blue sky, even in England this evening there's a blue sky, then is the blue that I'm seeing the same blue that you're seeing? And maybe it isn't. And we know it isn't, in fact. There are people who are native Russian speakers see different shades of blue. So we're doing a series of experiments called the Perception Census over the rest of this year. It's launching in June. Trying to get at, in very large samples, we're trying to map out subtle differences in how people perceive the world that we suspect exist but have never really been measured before. So what is the nature and shape of this hidden inner diversity? We're all used to external diversity now with different skin colors, shapes, sizes. But this inner diversity, I think, is by its nature, I cannot have your experience. And if you use the same words and behave more or less the same way, you have to do some quite detailed experiments to figure out, are you actually seeing the same thing? So we're making a start in that direction, and I'm going to be fascinated how it turns out.
All right, AI. So my favorite question on this is, does Big Blue know that it beat the great Gary Kasparov in chess? Does Watson know that it won Jeopardy and it beat Ken Jennings? And of course, the answer I get is they don't even know they're playing chess, and they don't even know they're playing Jeopardy. They don't even know what a game is, right? But at some point, you could program into Big Blue, yay, I won. And it says those words and it laughs or cheers or whatever. But that would just be programmed. We wouldn't intuitively think, well, it feels happy that it beat Gary Kasparov in chess. But at some point, what's the difference between a super advanced AI that has all the programs we have and then us?
I think we may be approaching some quite dangerous territory here with technology as it is. So you talk about these examples of programming Deep Blue or AlphaGo Zero to say yay when it wins. But in other advances in AI, we're getting close, very close already, to coming up with persuasive simulations of aware creatures. We have already two powerful technologies. We've got these language generation networks like GPT-3, which can convincingly spew out sentences. They can engage in dialogue. And GPT-4, GPT-7 will probably be very conversationally adept. And then we have deepfakes. You can train neural networks to very convincingly have animated avatars of people who can either be real or fake people saying things. And if you couple those together, you're already in a world, and this is a very near future, even maybe now, but very near future, where we have software technologies where I could be talking to a virtual Michael Shermer. You're on my computer screen now. Might be a deepfake animated by a GPT-10 algorithm trained on a whole corpus of your previous podcasts. Now, this would give me the strong impression I'm talking to something that is aware, that has conscious experiences, even if there is no good reason to believe that there's any awareness behind it. It's just the crunching of some very powerful statistical pattern recognition algorithms. And a lot of people talk about the big existential question of whether a robot or a computer or a machine could ever be conscious. And that's worth talking about, that question, I think. But in my view, that's still very far away. We're much closer to an also disruptive tipping point where we inhabit a world populated by systems for which it's very, very difficult for us to tell. And what that will do to us as society is really, really unclear. And I would like some of the ethical noise that's hovering around artificial consciousness, Terminator robots and the like, and simulation theory and uploading and all these things, to refocus a little bit on some of these things which are actually going to happen and actually are happening right now.
So you could make an avatar of Putin saying, I'm going to nuke the United States if they send troops into the Donbass region. Oh, wait, he did say that. But if somebody said something worse, I'm launching the nuclear weapons at noon today, and then President Biden sees this and goes, oh, my God, well, we got to know if that's real or not. So how close are we to be able to do something like that within years or faster?
Well, I think so. I mean, it's part of my collaborations are with machine learning groups, and actually my original training was in AI, but not really in the machine learning thing. But yeah, we're working on with some of my colleagues, Chris Buckley and Alec Chance. We work on machine learning versions of this predictive coding algorithm that do very well in various tasks and have some biological plausibility. But it's not really our work. I'm really thinking of these other algorithms that have been trained on billions and billions of data points. There was the DALL-E algorithm just recently that can generate amazing pieces of visual art by combining, I was like sort of Roman sculptures with Picasso or something like that. What these algorithms do is amazing. I am slightly with Gary Marcus on this question though too, because I think yes, these algorithms are very good at specific things, but back to your point about does Deep Blue know that it's playing chess? No. Even an algorithm that is very good at language and deepfaking is good at those things. It's not going to make you a cup of tea or drive your car or solve a complex math problem. Might be able to do that. So there's still a lot of clear air between the trajectory of these deep learning algorithms that we have and what people are calling general AI, the ability that we have to be very flexible in our response to new situations, put things together in completely different ways, generalize beyond the data that we're trained on. That's still a gap that remains to be solved. And the fascinating thing for me is that when you look at the kinds of things that we humans are good at, that AI still really struggles with, these are the sort of things that are associated with conscious compared to unconscious perception. our unconscious perception is also very good at pattern recognition. But if we're to respond very flexibly to a new set of circumstances, we have to experience that scene consciously. So here for me is this is where I think the real progress will be in connecting these fields of consciousness research and artificial intelligence, not in this hubristic goal of building a conscious machine, which I think is ethically wrong anyway. We shouldn't even be trying to do that. You build something that's conscious, you have to worry about it. You have a moral obligation to it. It might be suffering and you wouldn't even know. But in this intersection, we might actually be able to enhance AI by trying to figure out what is it about consciousness that allows us to behave with this particular kind of general intelligence for things we consciously perceive. And then there's a nice synergy. We'll understand consciousness a bit better by having models of it from AI, and we'll be able to build better AI by implementing some of the functions associated with consciousness. So this is actually a project that we've been shaping with colleagues of mine in AI, with Yoshua Bengio, who's one of the pioneers of deep learning. We're trying to take this view and map out a research agenda that gets away from the more hubristic elements and tries to figure out what the productive interactions are.
Yeah, so this then gets us to the question of the role of emotions in AI. Often the talk centers around, it wants this or it wants that. Why would it want anything? That's kind of an emotion. And I was thinking about this. Leonard Mlodinow was just on the podcast. He wrote a book on emotions. He's Stephen Hawking's co-author. He's a physicist at Caltech, smart guy. But he also wrote for Star Trek. So we got to talking about Star Trek: The Next Generation, right? So they would always have data doing.
I knew Star Trek was going to come up at some point.
It has to come up, right? So I asked him, data is data almost human or whatever. Data is always trying to get emotion, so he understands human humor and so forth. And Len made the point that, well, we just had to write in stuff for him to do, because if he's really just an AI, he would just sit there on the bridge doing nothing until you gave him something to do. So you'd have to program in, like, if Captain Picard walks onto the bridge, you are to stand up, turn around, and greet the captain and ask him if he needs anything. And otherwise, he's not going to do anything because he doesn't want anything, right? So how do you think about emotions in AI?
Well, I think it's maybe not such a unique problem. So I think it's the same sort of situation as you had with an AI system reporting that it enjoyed something or knows something. There's absolutely no reason you can't build in goals, drives, desires to artificial systems. I mean, this is already being done. A lot of reinforcement learning works this way. You build in a goal function. And, in doing so, you're not making the claim that the algorithm or the robot that it's controlling or shaping the behavior of is having the experience of wanting, desiring something, or satisfaction on obtaining that goal. But you can certainly design in goals. That's already happening. And you can design in simulated emotions. You could certainly design in, and they might be useful. They might be useful things to build in. So, artificial systems could monitor their progress towards a goal. And that could be reflected in some sort of readout of valence. Things are going bad. Things are going well.
So
something has happened which wasn't expected.
Yeah.
That could be a measure of surprise. But in none of this are you saying that the system is actually feeling anything. But emotions provide a useful functional architecture for developing AI systems, especially those that engage in goal-directed behavior or control.
Right. So when I push the little button on my Tesla steering wheel and say, navigate LAX, and it pops up the map of how to get to LAX, and then I start on the route, and it constantly reroutes me because of traffic. That's kind of an updated system, but I don't think my Tesla feels like happy we got there in time, or I'm sorry we're late, or I feel really bad that we took this long route. Nothing like that. And why would you ever need to add that?
That's a very good question. I think in most cases you wouldn't, right? You wouldn't even need to add things that simulate having that. But there might be situations where it becomes very useful. Our emotions help us behave. So, for instance, we there are things like disappointment. If something doesn't turn out as planned, it's useful for us to recognize that. And then regret, that we're disappointed, but we should have done something else. For us to experience regret, we have to have the ability to engage in counterfactual reasoning. So simulating some regret function in AI or machine learning could be a useful way to implement counterfactual reasoning about making plans of actions. Again, without any claim that there's any experience going on, but just the architecture of these emotions could be useful. And then when you talk about maybe robots rather than disembodied algorithms, a lot of our emotional experiences are bound up with the integrity of the body. How well is regulation of the body going? Am I likely to stay alive in the next day, hour, minute, year? Do I need food? Do I need water? Emotions bring these physiological needs to the surface, in our case, the surface of consciousness, so that they can guide our behavior. So again, it could be useful to equip artificial systems with simulated emotions so that, if they run out of power or there's some damage or something like that, those aspects that are impinging on their bodily integrity can surface to their control architecture and guide their behavior.
Right. I was just thinking of an example, kind of a fun example where emotions and information processing are kind of intertwined. My wife and I say I love you each day to each other. And of course we feel it. It's not obligations. No one's collecting data on this. But if she told me multiple times in a row, I love you, and I said something like, oh, that's nice, or, oh, thank you. At some point you go, yes. And it's got to come back. If you don't reciprocate, then I'm going to begin to wonder, update my priors. I thought you loved me, but now you're not repeating it. So has something changed in the environment? Is there somebody else, whatever, right? So they're all intertwined. You can't really separate them in that sense. Okay, last two questions. One on this. So on the are we living in a matrix? Is this all a simulation? Because everything you just said, we're going to achieve, if not in the next 5 years, 50 years, 500 years, whatever the time scale is. And we're not probably the first in the universe to develop intelligence. So somebody else, the bell curve, we're not special. Somebody's behind us. Somebody's ahead of us. There's likely to be people ahead of us. They've already done this. We're in a simulation. What do you think about that whole argument?
So this is the argument that traces to people like Nick Bostrom and others that, yes, maybe we're in a simulation and there's some base reality many layers below. David Chalmers, of course, talks about this in his, you had a chat with him recently as well, in his book on reality. I think it's a fascinating idea to play with. I don't find it remotely useful at all. There's a distinction between the simulation argument and hypothesis, right? So there's this argument that it's possible and the hypothesis that we are. And but Bostrom, at least, as far as I understand his basic argument, it's mainly a statistical argument that if we're not the only civilization that's reached technological capacity, then computer power does grow very fast, and so there'll be some civilization somewhere that is able to run very, very powerful simulations, and be some non-zero subset of those will run ancestor simulations of previous generations, and so given the ease of running many, many such simulations, then it's more likely that we are in a simulation rather than in the base reality. So I have a couple of objections to this. Firstly, it's sort of drawing statistical arguments where there's absolutely no good basis to make any claims about probability at all. You're drawing numbers out of thin air, and maybe you say it only matters that they're different from zero, but I still find it uncompelling to make a statistical case where there are no good priors at all. But the most important thing is there is another fundamental assumption in the simulation argument, which is that consciousness is something that can be simulated. This is back to the substrate independent thing. That consciousness is something that can exist in a simulation of conscious creatures. Now, this may be true. Maybe consciousness is substrate independent and is something that can be simulated. But it is far from obvious that it is true. And in fact, my general intuition is that it's not true, that consciousness, like many things, like wetness, is is intrinsically bound up with the stuff it's made of. Exactly how and why that should be the case is hard to say, but we are living creatures, and the relevance of our nature as living goes all the way down. It goes into our conscious experience, sort of bottoms out it's grounded in self-regulation, and self-regulation, in my view anyway, goes right down to how individual cells maintain themselves. It's not something that stops at a particular level of biological implementation. So life may breathe fire into the equations of consciousness, not information processing. If that's the case, then we're not in a simulation, because we wouldn't be conscious if we were. And then what difference does it make if we are? It's one of these hypotheses that I don't think really helps. You end up like looking for glitches in the simulation. I don't know, but then that's an indirect way of studying perception, and I don't think you're going to find a glitch. Making claims about the mental architecture of these supposed simulators. How would they design it? I mean, it just goes off into the realm of, I think, unproductive speculation. And I think this has real consequences, because we live in a world now where we're not doing a very good job of stewarding the real world that we live in,
much less the Matrix.
And there's I think a danger into just thinking, oh well, maybe it doesn't really matter because it's all just a simulation anyway. I know people don't literally think this, but it's the kind of perspective that if you at some level believe it's plausible we're in a simulation, it does mitigate against you taking the real world as it really is, as seriously as we all should right now. So, that's not, the fact that we shouldn't believe it is of course not an argument whether it's true or not.
Right. Yeah.
That's irrelevant.
That's a good
point. I might not like an argument, it doesn't matter.
Right.
But I don't think it is true for these other reasons.
Several times during our recording today, you've kind of frozen and there's been some buffering. If we were in a studio together and that happened, then it would be like, wait a minute, he just blapped out of and disappeared for a moment. Okay, there's something wrong. That reminds me of my one of my favorite Star Trek: The Next Generation episodes. And sorry for the repetition for regular listeners, but it was called The Ship in the Bottle. So they go into the holodeck and they're running the Sherlock Holmes program, and the arch rival Moriarty is interacting with the characters. And then at some point, he just walks out of the holodeck into the Enterprise. And they're all like, whoa, how did this happen? He doesn't exist outside of the holodeck. How did he get into the Enterprise, right? So the rest of the episode, they're trying to figure out how this happened, what went wrong. And Moriarty wants to bring his sweetheart into the real ship instead of in the holodeck, so they can have their a relationship together in the real world and so on. And then at the very end, one of the characters notices one of the other regular people on the ship is now left-handed rather than right-handed, and he realizes, oh, we're still in the holodeck. It's just a simulation of the Enterprise in the holodeck, and then it ends where the guy, he's leaving the holodeck and he's now in the regular Enterprise, and he looks up and says, computer, end program. And then it's like, oh, whew, okay. So this part is real, right? And then the episode ends where they show a little box, and they say that's where Moriarty and his sweetheart are. They're in that box. In their mind, they're on the Enterprise exploring the galaxy together, but in reality, they're in the little box. So even Chalmers says at some point there has to be a little box. There has to be some hardware running the program, and that if you had simulations on top of simulations, you'd run out of computing power. And therefore you'd get the glitches and so on. So that might be one way to test it, that if there'd have to be glitches at some point because you'd run out of computing power. Anyway.
Yeah, maybe. I mean, I don't see, I think it's not a hypothesis I feel particularly motivated to go looking to test. Now, I think the much more important way to take that is that, I think what we've been talking about for most of our chat is that the world we experience is not the world as it really is. There is a level of indirectness to that. And in that sense, we are living in some sort of matrix because we're not seeing the world as it really is. It's a construction of the brain. But it does really exist too. And that for me is a fascinating way to think of that, rather than that there is this nested, possibly not bottomless array of simulations and we're in it somewhere or other. I don't yeah, of course, if it turns out, if somebody does find a glitch in the Matrix, if we do meet in real life and suddenly you blip in and out of existence, then I will think again about this question.
All right, last question on free will and determinism. You're a scientist. We live in a determined universe. How do you square that with whatever your position is on free will or volition or whatever word you want to use?
This is a beauty of a question to finish on. Free will. I really enjoyed writing the chapter on free will in my book because I thought about it a lot, but I've not written about it in any research papers before, and it helped clarify a lot of things. I don't think the stochasticity determinism argument is remotely relevant to whether we have free will or not. It can only be relevant if you're trying to preserve a kind of spooky free will that can take advantage of stochasticity and sort of use that elbow room to make things happen that otherwise wouldn't happen. This is very spooky libertarian free will that I don't think we should even be looking for. So much would have to be wrong for that to make any sense whatsoever. And stochastic systems obey laws too. They're just stochastic laws. Now, this isn't to say that we don't have any kind of free will. We as biological agents, we execute voluntary actions and we experience them as being voluntary. And some of the actions we execute, when a voluntary action is an action that is not immediately prescribed by the environment, I decide to pick up this cup of tea now. And why do I do that? Well, it's a combination of previous history, my prior preferences for drinking tea, the availability of tea, and so on. But it feels like a voluntary action, and that's important. Now, the key thing for me is that the fact that it seems to be a voluntary action. The key thing for me is that the fact that it seems to come from within, and it seems as though the experience of volition causes the action, doesn't mean that that's what the experience is actually doing. So I like to think of free will in the same way that I think about experiences of, again, color. I experience color as really existing in the world. It doesn't mean that it does, but experiencing color is a very useful thing for the brain to do. So why does the brain experience some actions as being freely willed? Well, it's very useful for the brain to keep track of those actions that come from within, that are aligned with beliefs and desires, and have the sense of could have done otherwise. I could have picked up a different glass. But the meaning of those characteristics of the experience is not because that's what's actually going on. It's very useful for the brain in learning how to behave. So this idea that I could have done otherwise is not useful in the here and now, because whether the world is deterministic or stochastic, I can only do one thing. But it's useful the next time. I experience it that I could have done otherwise, because the next time I'm in a similar situation, maybe I will do otherwise. And as we said earlier, we never step into the same river twice, where it's a different river and we're a different person. So I think free will is the experience of free will is real, and voluntary actions are real, and these characteristics of why we experience free will are important, just as our experience of color, of shape, of emotion is important. It plays a biological role, but it's not what we might otherwise think it to be. It's not some essence of soul that swoops into the windmills of the mind and changes the direction of their flow or whatever and makes things happen that otherwise wouldn't happen. Okay, there's no need for that kind of spooky free will.
Right. Perfectly articulated, perfect place to end it, because I love that title, Being You. That's what it means to be you, is you are a volitional agent to some extent. You have some control. So that's a perfect way to end it. Thank you for your work. Thanks for coming on the show. We went over 2 hours. Very good. Fantastic topics to discuss. So thank you.
Thank you, Michael. It's a real pleasure and a privilege. Thank you very much for having me on the show.